Hey folks, tonight we're crashing the medieval tax party, and trust me, the guest list alone would make you wish for a time machine, back to your comfy couch. Imagine waking up in 1325, rubbing the sleep from your eyes, only to find a royal scroll stuffed under your straw mattress, demanding your tax return. Not just any tax return, but one written in a language so tangled it might as well be wizardry. You're expected to decode this cryptic scroll, fill out endless forms, and pay a fee that would make even the fiercest dragon hoarders clutch their treasure nervously. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, buckle up, because by the end of this tale, you'll understand why dropping today's tax system into medieval Europe would have sparked revolutions, witch hunts, and probably a few surprise public executions. No big deal. Now picture your humble one-room hut, the scent of unwashed wool blankets, mixing with last week's mouldy bread. And add to that the mental load of tax paperwork. Spoiler alert, medieval peasants didn't sign up for spreadsheets, online portals or deduction clauses. Their economy was about as complicated as a stick and a rock, which is exactly why trying to shove modern tax laws into their world would be catastrophic. You'd see the poorest drowning in paperwork, while the noble lords chuckled over goblets of wine, sipping taxes straight out of your pockets without even lifting a finger. Classy, right? The Middle Ages were infamous for many things: plagues, punishments, and pottage. But what's rarely mentioned is how brutally unforgiving their tax system could be when tangled with today's mind-boggling rules. Historians still argue whether medieval taxes were a survival tool for the crown or just an elegant way to keep peasants miserable. But one thing's crystal clear: slap modern taxes on this era and you're inviting a meltdown, bigger than a fire-breathing dragon roasting the royal treasury. So before you get comfy, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this madness. And hey, drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's step into the shoes of a medieval peasant. Your income is whatever scraps you can scavenge from the fields. Your tax bill is a monstrous weight you can't escape, and your tax collector is less a polite visitor and more a harbinger of doom. The idea of filing tax returns would be as alien to you as a smartphone at a jousting tournament. Imagine the chaos if you had to itemize your chicken's grain sacks and goat cheese for the crown's accountants, who probably can't tell a carrot from a cudgel. Your day starts not with a morning coffee, but with the tolling of the church bell, and the grim reality that the tax collector might already be on his way. Unlike modern tax agencies, medieval collectors had no HR department, no customer service hotline, just a ruthless blend of fear, intimidation, and occasionally a club to the ribs. Bribery was the unofficial tax-deductible expense, and dodging payment was a gamble with your thumb's toes or worse. Remember, medieval taxes weren't just about raising coin, they were about control. Kings needed money for wars, castles, and lavish feasts. The crown's accountants worked on a simple principle: squeeze peasants as much as possible without sparking outright rebellion, though sometimes they miscalculated. The irony is thick. The more they taxed, the hungrier peasants became, often leading to less income overall, because starving people can't exactly pay up. Here's a quirky fact: in some places, peasants paid taxes not with coins, but with chicken's grain or even live pigs. So your tax return might look like a chicken coop, a sack of wheat, or an angry sow waddling off to the Lord's manor. Try explaining that to the IRS. Historians still debate whether these payments in kind were a form of fairness or just medieval loopholes to make peasants' lives more miserable. What's undeniable is that today's tax forms with deductions, exemptions, and credits would have been as welcome in 1325 as a rainstorm during harvest. Bottom line, modern taxes rely on record-keeping digital infrastructure and a complex economy, all things medieval Europe lacked. Introducing today's tax system back then would be a catastrophic mismatch, like trying to fit a smartphone into a leather pouch designed for carrying chickens. So as you trudge through this medieval tax nightmare, in your mind brace yourself. The chaos has only just begun. Ever tried to balance your checkbook while riding a horse through a muddy field? Now imagine doing that when your entire wealth is a handful of chickens, a sack of grain, and a rusty plough that's seen better days. Welcome to medieval economics, where the idea of complex finance is about as foreign as Wi-Fi to a blacksmith. You might think managing a few coins is simple, but when you have to calculate taxes on livestock crops and even the number of people living under your roof, things get wildly complicated. Stay with me, because by the end of this section, you'll discover why modern tax forms would make medieval peasants throw down their tools and flee to the woods. Let's start with your morning no coffee, just a soggy slice of bread, and the knowledge that your entire livelihood depends on the success of your tiny farm patch. You don't have bank statements or digital ledgers. You have memories, some chalk marks on a wooden plank, and a prayer to Saint Whatever. Your wealth isn't counted in dollars or euros, but in chickens clucking bushels of rye and the unpredictable number of eggs laid this week. Each of these things could be taxed, but good luck explaining that on a form. Medieval peasants lived in a world where economics was tangible and immediate. There was no abstract income, only what you grew, raised, or bartered. A barn full of grain could mean survival through winter or a tax collector's feast. If the harvest failed, so did your ability to pay. And because peasants had to pay in kind or coin, sometimes the difference between life and death was whether your tax was exact or lenient, though leniency was rare. Here's a quirky fact: in some villages, taxes were paid not only on tangible goods, but on intangible things, like the number of hearths in a house, or even the number of windows. That's right, your cosy one-room hut with a single smoky opening could be taxed for every way light slipped in. The very thought of taxing windows sounds absurd today, but back then it was a legitimate revenue stream for lords who were desperately scraping by. Historians still argue whether these arbitrary taxes were clever ways to maximize revenue, or just ways for the elite to squeeze every last penny from their subjects without causing too many uprisings. Spoiler alert, the peasants didn't always appreciate the effort. Now imagine handing a modern tax form to a medieval peasant. There's no concept of a W-2 or a 1099. Instead, you're asking them to quantify wealth. They barely measure themselves. How much is your goat worth? What about the eggs it lays? And don't forget to calculate your income from selling vegetables, barter goods, and occasional coin payments from a rare harvest. To make things worse, literacy was scarce. Most peasants couldn't read or write, so the tax forms and demands were handed down orally or via crude scribbles. The mental gymnastics required to translate that into accurate tax payments was enough to make anyone's head spin. So why does this matter? Because today's tax system assumes a level of economic sophistication and record-keeping that simply didn't exist in medieval times. Introducing it there would be like giving a caveman an Excel spreadsheet, utterly useless and deeply frustrating. By the time you finish this section, you'll understand why medieval peasants' simple economies would crumble under the weight of modern tax bureaucracy, and why the whole system would quickly descend into chaos, confusion, and a few well-aimed pitchforks. Now let's zoom in on how peasants tracked their assets. Unlike us who rely on apps and bank alerts, medieval peasants relied on memory simple marks on wood or stone, and sometimes the village gossip to keep tabs on what they owned. Picture this: you wake up, stroke your scruffy beard, and mentally inventory your holdings: 3 chickens, 2 goats, a sack of barley, and enough firewood to last the week. If you're lucky, You remember how many eggs the hens laid yesterday. That's your entire portfolio. Contrast that with today's tax systems, which demand precise records receipts and digital statements. The idea of itemizing expenses or keeping a ledger would have seemed like black magic or a cruel joke to someone living in a drafty mud hut. And speaking of huts, the structure of medieval homes also complicated taxation. Some villages levied taxes based on the size or materials of your dwelling. Did your roof leak? That might save you a few coins. But if you had sturdy timber walls instead of mud bricks, congratulations, you owe more tax. It's the medieval version of location, except it's more roof. The idea of household income was another foreign concept. Many peasants worked as part of extended families or communal groups. Income was shared, debts were communal, and barter was king. Calculating individual earnings for tax purposes, nearly impossible. Oh, and let's not forget the seasonal nature of medieval work. Harvest time was frantic, spring was hopeful, and winter was survival. Your income, and thus your tax liability, fluctuated wildly. Taxing peasants without taking the seasons into account was like trying to charge ice cream sales tax in the middle of a blizzard, absurd and doomed to fail. Here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Some medieval tax systems included poll taxes, which charged a flat fee per person regardless of wealth or income. So whether you were the village blacksmith or the farmer with one chicken, you paid the same. Imagine explaining to a modern government why this is a bad idea. Hint, it caused a famous rebellion in England. Historians still argue whether poll taxes were a fair way to raise revenue or just a recipe for social unrest. Spoiler alert, the peasants didn't exactly RSVP to that party. The complexity and unfairness of medieval taxes created a breeding ground for corruption. Tax collectors often abused their power, demanding more than was owed and pocketing the difference. Some peasants resorted to clever tricks to hide assets or bribe officials. The whole system was a mess of informal agreements, threats, and last-minute negotiations. Imagine trying to navigate this labyrinth with modern tax forms requiring itemized receipts, digital signatures, and multi-page explanations. The peasants would likely toss their quills, stomp off to the forest, and start a rebellion. It wasn't just about money, it was about survival and sanity. So to wrap up this chaotic picture, medieval peasants lived in a world where economic simplicity was a necessity, not a choice. Their accounts were kept in their heads, their taxes paid in chickens and crops, and their livelihoods dependent on unpredictable factors like weather and politics. Introducing today's complex tax systems to that world would have been catastrophic. Imagine expecting someone to file a 50-page tax return when they can barely read. The mental, physical, and social toll would be enormous. But don't take my word for it. Historians continue to debate how medieval economies functioned so smoothly despite these challenges, and whether introducing structured tax systems could ever have worked. Next, we'll dive into the fascinating and terrifying world of medieval tax collectors, those infamous figures who bridged the gap between crown and peasant and often left chaos in their wake. You might think tax collectors today have a bad rap, but in the Middle Ages, they were something else entirely. Imagine the taxman arriving at your door, not in a suit, but in iron armour, wielding a club and a scowl sharp enough to cut through steel. These were your friendly neighbourhood collectors, part bureaucrat, part enforcer, and full-time nightmare. Curious how these characters managed to keep the tax system running, stick around because the answer involves bribery, beatings, and a flair for drama that would make reality TV producers jealous. Picture this: you're tending your meagre flock when a shadow looms. A tax collector accompanied by a handful of guards, eyes scanning for any excuse to shake you down. Unlike today's polite letters and email reminders, Medieval tax collectors were notorious for showing up unannounced, demanding payment on the spot. Failure to comply wasn't met with a phone call. It often ended with a very public display of justice, involving stocks, whippings, or a creative use of the local dungeon. A cheerful welcome, right? The relationship between peasants and tax collectors was complicated, to say the least. On one hand, these collectors were agents of the crown, tasked with filling royal coffers to fund wars, castles, and lavish banquets. On the other, they were often corrupt opportunists who saw taxes as a personal payday. Bribery was the unofficial currency of the tax world. If you could grease their palms, you might keep a few extra chickens or sacks of grain. Here's a fun fact: in some regions, tax collectors were allowed to keep a percentage of what they collected, creating an incentive to be as ruthless as possible. Imagine a commission-based job where the harder you squeeze the peasants, the bigger your bonus. No wonder these collectors were both feared and hated. Historians still argue whether this system encouraged accountability or simply fueled corruption and abuse. What's clear is that peasants often found themselves in an impossible position, paying exorbitant taxes or facing brutal punishment. And it wasn't just physical intimidation. The mere threat of a tax audit, though less formal than today's letters, could cause panic. If the collector suspected you of hiding assets or underreporting, they had wide latitude to investigate. Investigate often meant a very unorthodox form of interrogation, involving devices designed to extract confessions through pain. Talk about motivation. Medieval tax collectors were also masters of psychological warfare. They knew that fear was a powerful tool to ensure compliance. Public punishments of tax evaders weren't just about retribution, they were about sending a clear message to anyone thinking about cheating the system. This theatre of punishment kept the tax machinery humming, albeit at a brutal cost. On the lighter side, some tax collectors were surprisingly inventive. They used creative methods to assess wealth, counting livestock by sound or estimating grain stores by the size of barn shadows. It wasn't always accurate, but it kept things interesting. Imagine your tax bill based on how loudly your cows moo. But the downside, entire villages could be punished collectively if the tax quota wasn't met. This sometimes meant destroying crops, confiscating goods, or imprisoning innocent people. The line between tax enforcement and collective punishment was blurry at best. So next time you gripe about the IRS, remember the medieval tax collector, the original bad cop of fiscal policy. They combined the worst parts of bureaucracy and brutality, ensuring that taxes were paid one terrified peasant at a time. Up next, we'll unravel the deadly impact of income taxes on medieval life. Why taxing the little you have feels more like an attack than a policy. Imagine this: you've just harvested your meagre crops, patched up your wool tunic, and managed to keep your chickens alive through the worst of winter. You breathe a small sigh of relief, then bam, here comes the income tax. Only your income is barely enough to feed yourself, let alone pay the king's insatiable appetite for coins. Welcome to the medieval version of being taxed into oblivion, where income tax wasn't a gentle tap, but a full-on assault, the fiscal equivalent of a catapult to your wallet. Now, income tax, as we know it, is a relatively modern invention, but medieval rulers did have ways to tax peasants on their earnings, which often meant anything of value they possessed or produced. It's like trying to squeeze blood from a stone, except the stone is your entire farm, your goats, your cooking pot, and your last pair of socks. And believe me, taxing the income of a medieval serf would have crushed them faster than the Black Death. Your earnings might be a few bushels of wheat, a handful of eggs, or some wool spun after a long day's toil. Now imagine the tax collector calculating what percentage of these paltry goods you owe to the Lord. The result, you're left with barely enough to survive, which, if history has taught us anything, is a great recipe for unrest. Here's a quirky medieval twist sometimes. Instead of taxing, income rulers taxed heads or hearths, a flat rate, regardless of how much you actually earned. That means whether you had a bumper crop or a bad year, the tax bill was the same. This flat income tax was less about fairness and more about filling coffers quickly, often at the expense of the poorest. Historians still argue whether this kind of taxation system helped sustain kingdoms or hastened their collapse by draining the peasants dry. Spoiler alert, it often did the latter. And the impact was brutal. Unlike today, where social safety nets exist, medieval peasants who fell behind on taxes risked losing their land freedom or worse. Some were forced into debt peonage, essentially becoming serfs tied to the land to pay off their tax debts indefinitely. Now imagine trying to explain all this to someone expecting a standard paycheck. For peasants, the concept of income was blurry at best. You didn't receive wages in coin regularly. You earned in kind or through barter. Paying income tax meant parting with the very goods that kept you alive. No surprise that tax revolts were common. Let's throw in one more medieval oddity. Sometimes taxes were collected on produced goods, meaning if you spun wool or brewed ale, you had to pay taxes on those goods, even before selling them. This preemptive taxation crushed many small producers and craftsmen, shrinking local economies before they could grow. In fact, taxing what little peasants produced was a slow death by 1,000 cuts. Each tax bite chipped away at their meagre livelihoods until survival became a daily gamble. So why do modern income taxes make such a mess in this context? Because the system assumes a steady, measurable income, proper bookkeeping, and ideally some disposable income. Medieval peasants had none of these. Trying to impose our tax codes on their world would be like trying to install solar panels on a horse-drawn cart. Noble intention, disastrous execution. Before we move on, here's a smile-worthy note. In some parts of medieval Europe, peasants paid their income taxes in the form of labour rent, which meant they had to work for their lords instead of paying cash. So technically, they were taxed twice, once in goods or labour, and once in sheer exhaustion. Historians still debate whether this system was more exploitative or just plain desperate economics. Either way, it's safe to say that medieval income taxes were less about fairness and more about squeezing every last ounce of survival juice from a struggling population. Next, we'll explore the horrors of the value-added tax, or VAT medieval style, and why this modern tax invention would have left merchants tearing out their beards in frustration. Imagine walking through a bustling medieval market, wooden stalls creaking under baskets of apples, barrels of ale, frothing with promise, and merchants shouting prices that sound more like medieval rap battles. Now imagine that with every coin you hand over for that apple or sip of ale, you're slapped with a mysterious extra charge called the value-added tax, VAT for short. If your head's already spinning, don't worry. By the end of this section, you'll see exactly why VAT would have caused absolute chaos in medieval trade, and why the goat herders might have started trading their goats for pitchforks. VAT in its modern form is a tax added at each step of production or sale. So every seller charges a bit of tax, and that tax is paid up the chain until it reaches the government. Sounds reasonable, maybe if you have computers and accountants. Medieval merchants, not so much. These folks were juggling ledgers scratched in ink on parchment bartering goods that often didn't have fixed prices and dealing with customers who could barely count past 10. Picture this: a baker buys wheat from a farmer, adds his magic touch to turn it into bread, then sells it to a village family. With VAT, the farmer pays tax on the wheat, the baker pays tax on the bread, including the taxed wheat, and the customer pays tax on the final loaf. Taxes on taxes. It's a Russian nesting doll of fiscal frustration. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval towns tried rudimentary versions of this concept, taxing goods as they passed through markets or borders. Merchants complained loudly after all. How do you tax what's constantly moving, changing hands, and sometimes getting eaten before sale? Historians still argue whether these early market taxes helped fund growing city-states or just stifled trade by making merchants reluctant to travel. Spoiler alert, many medieval merchants preferred simpler tolls or flat market fees, anything to avoid the headache of calculating layered taxes. The VAT concept relies on robust accounting and record keeping, two things medieval Europe lacked. Without double-entry bookkeeping, electronic records, or standardized prices, keeping track of tax paid at each stage was nearly impossible. Merchants would either overpay, underpay, or simply ignore the tax, creating a mess that would make modern auditors break into a cold sweat. The confusion wouldn't end at the marketplace. Peasants buying bread or ale would be hit with VAT without understanding why their daily essentials cost more. Imagine the outrage when that humble loaf of bread came with an invisible extra charge. Why must my bread be taxed again? They'd grumble likely while sharpening a pitchfork. Another medieval quirk: in some places, taxes were collected on goods before they even hit the market, meaning merchants were taxed for goods still in storage or transit. That's like paying a sales tax on your online shopping cart before you click buy. Needless to say, medieval traders found this maddening. If modern VAT were imposed back then, we'd probably see merchant guilds staging protests, markets shutting down, and trade routes rerouted to avoid tax collectors. The economy, already fragile, would have groaned under the strain. Now for a smile, some medieval tax collectors were so clueless about commerce, they'd tax things twice, or not at all, depending on their mood. Imagine trying to explain a VAT refund in a village where counting to 20 was considered advanced mathematics. So in sum, the medieval economy's fluid, informal nature was ill-suited to VAT's rigid demands. This tax concept was a square peg in a round hole, destined to jam the wheels of commerce and send merchants running for the hills or the nearest tavern. Next, we'll delve into the explosive topic of land taxes, why taxing soil in medieval times wasn't just about money, but often about sparking fiery rebellions and pitchfork politics. Picture this: you wake up one crisp morning to find a royal decree nailed to your door demanding tax payments on your patch of dirt. Yes, that same dirt you've scraped your life from since you were a child. Welcome to the medieval world of land taxes, where owning a few acres wasn't just a blessing, it was a potential death sentence if the taxman came calling. If you think modern property taxes are bad, wait until you hear how land taxes in the Middle Ages sparked revolts, riots, and more than a few pitchfork-wielding uprisings. Stick around, because by the end of this section, you'll understand why land taxes were the medieval kingdom's most combustible political powder keg. Land ownership was the backbone of medieval society. The more land you had, the more power you wielded. At least that's the theory. But here's the catch: most peasants didn't own their land outright. They rented or held it under the feudal system, pledging loyalty and taxes to a lord who could change the rules whenever it suited him. The land wasn't just dirt, it was survival status and identity, all rolled into one muddy patch. Enter the modern-style property tax, a steady bill based on the value of your land. For a medieval peasant, this would have been akin to charging rent on the air they breathed. You didn't just pay tax on the land, but on its produce, on the animals it sustained, and sometimes even on the buildings you had no legal right to build. It was a fiscal nightmare waiting to ignite. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, tax assessors measured land taxes not by size but by productive value, a subjective metric that meant your tax bill could rise or fall depending on how good your lord's mood was that day. Imagine waking up to a tax increase because your lord had a bad breakfast. Historians still debate whether land taxes were effective revenue tools or just catalysts for peasant revolts. The infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in England for instance, was partly sparked by resentment over oppressive taxes on land and labour. Pitchforks, torches and slogans like "No tax without representation" were the medieval equivalent of a viral protest hashtag. The complexity deepens when you consider that land boundaries were often poorly defined, leading to disputes over tax liabilities. Was that tree in your neighbour's field or yours? Did the brook count as a boundary? Such ambiguities caused endless quarrels with tax collectors, sometimes using them as excuses to extort more money. On a lighter note, some lords tried creative, if somewhat cruel, ways to increase tax revenue, like window taxes, which charged based on how many windows a house had. So if you built a bigger, brighter home, you might just have to pay more tax, encouraging peasants to live in the dark. Talk about a tax that dims your spirits. Land taxes weren't just economic burdens, they were political weapons. Lords used them to assert dominance, punish dissenters, and consolidate power. Failure to pay often meant eviction, imprisonment, or forced labour. Losing your land wasn't just losing property, it was losing your place in society. In fact, many peasants who fell behind on land taxes became serfs, tied to the land, bound to labour for their lord indefinitely. The land tax thus became a trap, a cycle of debt and servitude from which escape was nearly impossible. So why would introducing modern property taxes in medieval Europe be disastrous? Because these taxes assume clear ownership, legal protections, and fair assessments, luxuries medieval peasants didn't have. Throwing modern tax laws into this volatile mix would be like adding gunpowder to a bonfire. As you mull over the explosive history of land taxes, get ready next. We'll explore sin taxes, how the church might have cashed in on your vices and turned salvation into a ledger entry. Imagine walking into your local medieval tavern, hoping for a hearty ale and a break from the endless toil, only to find the priest standing at the door, ledger in hand, charging you a sin tax for every swig you take. Welcome to the world where the church wasn't just your spiritual guide, it was also your tax collector, and it had a keen eye for profiting off your guilty pleasures. Stick with me, because by the end of this section, you'll see why sin taxes in medieval times weren't just about morality. They were about filling coffers, controlling behaviour, and making Sunday service feel like a bill collector's visit. Sin taxes today might sound familiar. Those extra charges on cigarettes, alcohol, or gambling are meant to discourage harmful habits while raising revenue. But in medieval Europe, the church's version of sin taxes reached far beyond the obvious vices. From ale to special hobbies that whispered through tavern gossip, if it could be frowned upon, it could be taxed. Picture a scenario where every mug of ale you drink, every roll of dice at a game of chance, or even the mere act of courting a young maiden was subject to a tithe. The church viewed sin as a taxable commodity, a way to promote piety while lining its own pockets. The phrase sin and pay might as well have been their motto. Here's a quirky medieval fact. In some towns, the church imposed extra fees on festivals and celebrations, treating joy itself as taxable. The merrier the event, the heavier the tax burden. It's like being fined for having fun, and medieval peasants weren't thrilled. Historians still argue whether these taxes were effective deterrents or merely tools of oppression. Some suggest that sin taxes created a culture of surveillance, where neighbours reported each other to avoid paying, double turning communities into watchdogs of morality and revenue alike. Imagine the local priest keeping a watchful eye, tallying sins with a quill as sharp as his tongue. Sunday confessions might have included a tax invoice alongside forgiveness. Missing Mass, that's another fee. Speaking out of turn, you guessed it, taxed. This intertwining of faith and finance made the church not only a spiritual authority, but also a formidable economic power. It could dictate how you lived, loved, and spent your gold, often simultaneously. And for those wondering about enforcement, let's just say the church's reach was extensive. Sin taxes weren't just suggestions, they came with consequences ranging from public shaming to excommunication. A medieval version of a credit score downgrade, but with eternal implications. The absurdity of sin taxes didn't escape the common folk. Jokes and songs circulated mocking the church's appetite for coin, with lines like "better to sin than pay the fee" echoing in taverns. The church's profit from human weakness was both a moral and fiscal paradox. So why would modern sin taxes wreak havoc in the Middle Ages? Because they would amplify an already tense relationship between peasants and religious authorities, making everyday life a constant negotiation between piety, pleasure, and paying up. As you digest this cocktail of faith, finance, and folly, prepare yourself. Next up, we'll dive into the corporate taxes of medieval craft guilds and why taxing them could trigger economic drama worthy of a soap opera. Imagine a medieval craftsman, hands stained with dye, face dusted with soot, proudly showing off his wares at the local market. Now imagine the king's tax collector swooping in with a new decree. Your guild must now pay taxes on every axe, every spool of thread, every cobbled boot. What follows? A perfect storm of economic chaos, guild drama, and the kind of squabbles that would make modern reality TV blush. Stay tuned, because by the end of this section, you'll see why taxing medieval guilds was like poking a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick. Medieval guilds were more than just trade unions. They were powerful social and economic institutions that controlled everything from production standards to apprenticeships. If you wanted a sword or a pair of shoes, chances are the local guild held the monopoly. This made guilds ripe targets for taxation. Taxing the guild meant taxing the entire local economy. But here's the kicker: guilds operated on delicate balances of power and tradition. They set prices, controlled quality, and sometimes arbitrated disputes. Taxing them too heavily risked upsetting this balance, causing guild members to withhold goods, raise prices, or worse, go rogue and start unregulated trade. In other words, taxes could shatter the fragile economic ecosystem faster than a blacksmith's hammer on a cracked anvil. A quirky tidbit: some guilds negotiated tax exemptions or reduced rates by offering gifts or services to the crown, like producing weapons for war or supporting royal ceremonies. This unofficial system of barter and influence often blurred the lines between tax and tribute, leaving historians debating whether these exemptions were privileges or bribes. The result: intense rivalry and political maneuvering within and between guilds. Taxation became not just a financial burden, but a source of conflict. Guild leaders schemed to protect their members, while kings and nobles pushed for more revenue. Historians still argue whether guild taxation stifled innovation by reinforcing monopolies, or whether it helped stabilize medieval economies by funding public works and defenses. Either way, taxing guilds was a tricky game of power and patience. For the average craftsman, these taxes could mean the difference between keeping his workshop open or closing up shop. Guilds sometimes pulled resources to pay taxes collectively, but if one member fell behind, the whole group could suffer penalties, a medieval version of joint liability that made every member's coin count. So why would modern corporate taxes be disastrous in this context? Because they disrupt the guild's self-regulating structures, unleashing economic chaos that rippled through communities. Imagine a smith forced to double his prices overnight, or a weaver losing her livelihood because taxes ate into her earnings. And here's a smile for you: some medieval guilds created secret codes and symbols to communicate about taxes and market conditions, turning tax evasion into an art form that could rival any spy thriller. As you ponder this blend of commerce and intrigue, get ready next. We'll explore the heartbreaking reality of inheritance taxes and why passing down a family estate in medieval times could be a financial minefield. Imagine this: your beloved great-grandfather just passed away, and instead of mourning in peace, you're hit with a monstrous bill, a tax on the inheritance he left behind. That ancestral manor, the family's modest farmland, the treasured heirlooms suddenly come with price tags so steep you might as well auction the family cat. Welcome to the medieval nightmare of estate taxes, where death wasn't just an end, but a financial trap that could shatter families for generations. Hang tight, because by the end of this section, you'll understand why inheritance taxes in medieval times were less about legacy and more about heartbreak. Inheritance taxes, or death duties, may sound like a modern invention, but medieval rulers had their ways of cashing in on the dearly departed. Whenever property changed hands, especially through inheritance, the crown demanded a cut. This wasn't just a one-time fee, it was a recurring burden that turned family legacies into liquid assets faster than you could say funeral procession. Now imagine trying to keep a family estate intact under such pressures. Many heirs found themselves forced to sell off land, livestock, or even serfs just to pay the taxman. The concept of passing down the family farm was often more myth than reality. Instead, estates fragmented, fortunes faded, and family pride was swallowed by debt. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, the church also claimed its share of inheritance, turning funerals into not only somber occasions, but expensive financial events. Sometimes families were required to fund masses or build memorials as part of their tax obligations, a spiritual and fiscal double whammy. Historians still debate whether these taxes were necessary to fund royal coffers, or whether they inadvertently weakened noble families, destabilizing local power structures. The unintended consequence: a cycle of poverty and power loss that rippled through generations. And don't forget the legal mess. Medieval wills were often contested, poorly written, or ignored altogether. Combined with heavy taxation, this meant heirs not only face financial ruin, but also bitter family feuds. Imagine a courtroom drama where the stakes are land honour and survival. The tragedy deepened because inheritance taxes disproportionately affected women and younger siblings, who often received little or nothing, forcing them into marriages or convents just to secure their livelihoods. So why would modern inheritance taxes be catastrophic in this world? Because they assume clear ownership, legal protections, and stable economies, all luxuries medieval families lacked. Dropping today's estate tax laws into that era would have made dying a costly gamble, with survivors paying dearly for their legacy. Before we move on, here's a light note. Some medieval nobles tried to avoid these taxes through clever tricks, transferring land before death or gifting estates to the church, leading to endless debates about legality and morality. As you reflect on the bittersweet legacy of medieval inheritance taxes, prepare yourself. Next, we'll dive into the nightmare of filing taxes without electricity, calculators, or even basic office supplies. Imagine this: you've survived the tax collector's visit, scrimped and saved your few coins, and now it's time to file your taxes. Only there's no computer, no calculator, not even a simple pen or printed form. Instead, you're handed a quill, a piece of parchment, and a dim candle flickering on a rickety wooden table. Welcome to the medieval tax filing nightmare, where paperwork was as exhausting as ploughing a field, and mistakes could land you in hot water or worse. Stick with me, because by the end of this section, you'll understand why filing taxes without electricity was more than a chore. It was an epic battle against confusion, ink blots, and sheer frustration. Picture your day beginning before dawn, the cold air biting at your fingers as you try to steady your hand for the delicate task of copying numbers onto parchment. No erasers, no undo buttons, one slip and you're forced to start over. And remember, literacy was a luxury. Most peasants couldn't read or write, relying on scribes or local clerks who might not be entirely trustworthy or sober. The tools of the trade were simple, but unforgiving: quills, ink pots, and wax seals. If your ink spilled or your parchment tore you, risked rejection or suspicion from tax officials. And with no photocopiers, every copy was painstakingly handmade. Imagine the time and effort wasted on a single tax form. Here's a quirky fact: some tax forms required seals from multiple officials to prove authenticity, leading to long waits in stuffy halls, trading favours, or bribing the right people. Filing taxes wasn't just about numbers, it was a social and political dance. Historians still debate whether medieval record-keeping was sophisticated enough to manage the increasing tax demands, or if chaos was the inevitable result. Spoiler: there were plenty of errors, lost documents, and deliberate obfuscations, making tax collection a game of chance. Add to this the seasonal rush taxes due during planting or harvest meant peasants had to juggle paperwork and survival. The mental toll of memorizing amounts, owed deadlines and penalties was enormous. And if you think today's tax season is stressful, try doing it under flickering candlelight after a day's hard labour, with your family waiting for dinner and the looming threat of penalties for mistakes. So why would modern tax filing be impossible in medieval times? Because it assumes access to technology, education, and infrastructure that simply didn't exist. Expecting a medieval peasant to navigate complex forms is like asking a knight to code software. Noble effort, doomed outcome. Before we move on, here's a smile. Some peasants developed quirky shorthand or doodles on their tax documents, turning drudgery into an unexpected art form. If only the tax collector appreciated the creativity. As you imagine the flickering candlelight and the scratch of quills, get ready. Next, we'll explore the terrifying reality of tax audits, where questions meant far more than you bargained for. Imagine the heart-stopping moment when a medieval tax collector shows up not just to collect your money, but to audit your humble estate, a word that in their world meant more than checking paperwork. Think less friendly review and more interrogation with medieval enhancements. If you thought modern audits were stressful, medieval ones were downright terrifying, with a side of torture devices you definitely didn't want to see up close. Stay with me, because by the end of this section, you'll understand why medieval tax audits were the stuff of nightmares, and why you'd wish you'd just paid the tax instead. In today's world, an audit means an accountant poring over your receipts. In medieval times, it meant facing grim officials with a wide array of motivational tools. Auditors had near absolute power to extract confessions of tax evasion, often by means that would make a modern criminal lawyer faint. Imagine questions like, "Where's your hidden goat?" followed by a gentle suggestion to reconsider your answer, courtesy of a rack or thumbscrews. The stakes were high. Failure to pass an audit could result in hefty fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. Sometimes the punishment wasn't just for you, but your entire family or village, creating an atmosphere of fear that kept people compliant or desperate. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. In some cases, tax auditors used bizarre truth tests, like forcing suspects to hold hot irons or walk over fire. If you passed, you were innocent. If you failed, well, you were obviously guilty. Not exactly fair, but certainly effective at keeping taxes flowing. Historians still debate how often these brutal methods were used versus more administrative tactics. What's certain is that the threat of such punishment ensured that tax evasion was incredibly risky, but it also bred deep resentment and occasional uprisings. Tax auditors were not just bureaucrats, They were feared enforcers, combining paperwork with pain in a way that ensured few dared cheat the system. If you thought your last audit was rough, just be glad you didn't have to endure medieval enhanced interrogation techniques. The psychological impact was immense. Communities lived under the constant threat that any transaction, barter, or good deed could be scrutinized. Trust was scarce. Neighbors sometimes reported each other to curry favor or avoid suspicion. On a lighter note, some tax auditors were known for their sharp wit and storytelling skills, turning audits into theatrical events where compliance was won through a mix of fear and entertainment. Think Shakespeare meets the IRS. So why would modern tax audits be catastrophic in the Middle Ages? Because today's system relies on transparency, legal protections, and appeals all alien concepts in medieval courts. Instead, audits were brutal, public, and final. As you imagine this dark chapter of fiscal history, prepare for the finale, the catastrophic chaos that would unfold if today's entire tax system was dropped into medieval Europe, and why you definitely wouldn't survive the bill. Picture the whole messy scenario. Modern tax laws crash land into the Middle Ages like a catapult-loaded barrel of chaos. Taxes on income, land sales, sins, inheritances, all crammed into a world where peasants live hand to mouth, scribes battle ink blots by candlelight, and tax collectors brandish clubs instead of calculators. What would happen next? Spoiler, it's not going to be pretty, and you certainly wouldn't survive the ordeal. Stick with me because this final act ties together the fiscal madness into a perfect storm of medieval mayhem. First, the sheer complexity of today's tax system would confound everyone. Peasants accustomed to simple barter and in-kind payments would face labyrinthine forms, rules and deadlines they couldn't read or understand. Tax collectors lacking computers but wielding brute force would demand payments with the urgency of a plague outbreak. The result, chaos, confusion, and widespread unrest. Add to that the sheer impossibility of record keeping. Without paper mills churning out parchment or ink supplies, abundant every receipt ledger or tax return would be a precious fragile thing, often lost, burned or destroyed by rain. The Crown would struggle to track payments, leading to double taxation, arbitrary fines, and tax collectors pocketing what they could. Then there's enforcement. Medieval tax audits were brutal, introduced modern penalties and interest rates, and you'd have desperate peasants facing ruin for simple mistakes. The threat of punishment would hang over every village like a dark cloud, turning neighbours against each other as they tried to avoid scrutiny. And let's not forget the economic impact. Taxes on nearly every transaction, from the farm gate to the market stall, would strangle trade and production. Merchants and craftsmen, burdened by corporate taxes and VAT, might simply quit, forcing economies into collapse. Peasants taxed on land income and production would have little left to survive, triggering famines and revolts. It's no wonder historians argue whether medieval societies could have handled even rudimentary tax systems, let alone today's sprawling fiscal labyrinth. What's clear is that imposing modern taxes, then, would be like fitting a steam engine onto a horse cart, ambitious but catastrophic. And for a last quirky note, you'd probably see new tax resistance movements spring up faster than medieval peasants could sharpen their pitchforks. Maybe even medieval versions of tax protesters, with banners reading, "No more taxes, bring back the Black Death," which ironically was less costly than some tax seasons. So as you lay back picturing the medieval tax chaos unfolding, remember, today's taxes are complicated. Yes, but at least you're not calculating your VAT on a sack of barley by candlelight, or hiding goats from a club-wielding collector. And now as the taxman retires and the kingdom waits with bated breath, it's time to slowly let these images fade, knowing that the medieval world's brutal tax reality is thankfully far behind us. Now slow your breath. Let the flickering torchlight soften in your mind's eye. The weight of ledgers and quills of taxes and turmoil drifts away like dust in a sunbeam. Feel your muscles loosen, your heart slow. Tonight you rest free from the chains of impossible demands from ink-stained fingers and counting sheep or chickens. The medieval tax nightmare is a tale of survival and chaos, but you here and now are safe. Breathe in, calm, breathe out, stress, and drift into a peaceful sleep where the only calculation is the rhythm of your breath. First, the sheer volume and intricacy of modern tax laws would overwhelm the simplest of souls. Today's tax codes stretch for thousands of pages, full of exceptions, deductions, credits, and penalties. Imagine trying to navigate this maze when your only education is how to mend a fence or plough a field. Without literacy, formal schooling, or even a basic understanding of currency, medieval peasants would find these demands utterly incomprehensible. The concept of filing taxes would be as alien as a smartphone to a blacksmith. The modern tax system assumes infrastructure tax offices, trained accountants, digital databases, and postal services. Medieval Europe lacked these entirely. Communication was slow and unreliable. Messages travelled by foot or horseback, often taking days or weeks to reach their destination. A misplaced parchment could mean lost payments and brutal consequences. The administrative nightmare would spiral out of control. Without adequate record keeping, tax collectors would resort to guesswork or coercion. Double taxation, arbitrary fines, and corruption would flourish. The peasants' already tenuous trust in authority would erode completely. They might refuse to pay taxes altogether, sparking uprisings that would rock kingdoms to their foundations. Now add to this the enforcement mechanisms of modern taxation audits, penalties, garnishments. In the medieval world, audits already involved intimidation and torture. Modern penalties for late payment or errors compounded by medieval brutality would be catastrophic. Imagine fines so high that peasants lose their homes, livelihoods, or even their freedom, all because they fail to understand a convoluted tax form. The economic consequences would be dire. Taxes on income, land, goods, services, and even personal sins would drain resources from peasants and merchants alike. Local economies, fragile and interdependent, would buckle under the strain. Markets would shrink, craftsmen would stop producing, and farmers would abandon fields. Starvation, poverty, and unrest would follow. There would be no safety nets. Modern welfare systems did not exist, so falling behind on taxes could plunge a family into destitution overnight. Serfdom would deepen, debt bondage would increase, and social mobility would grind to a halt. The gulf between nobility and peasantry would widen, breeding resentment and rebellion. Furthermore, the very notion of ownership was different. Land was often held conditionally under feudal lords, and property rights were fluid. Applying modern property taxes, with their strict legal definitions and assessments, would generate endless disputes. Who owns what? How much is it worth? Without modern surveying techniques or legal frameworks, taxation would be arbitrary and contentious. Consider also the social implications. Taxation was a form of control as much as revenue. It was a means for the crown and nobility to assert dominance. Imposing modern tax regimes could destabilize existing power structures, incite revolts, and fracture societies. The cultural fabric of medieval communities would tear under the strain of impossible fiscal demands. On a lighter note, you might imagine peasants using every trick in the book to evade taxes, hiding livestock in woods, disguising goods, or bribing corrupt officials. Tax resistance movements would flourish, blending folk tales, songs, and protests in to a rich tapestry of defiance. Historians debate endlessly about how medieval societies managed taxation with such limited resources and whether any form of modern system could ever have functioned then. What's clear is that the introduction of today's complex tax laws would be utterly catastrophic, breaking economies, societies, and perhaps the spirit of an entire era. So as you lay back now, picturing this whirlwind of fiscal mayhem, take comfort in knowing that while taxes today might feel overwhelming, at least they come with calculators, forms you can file online, and hopefully the occasional refund check. Now slow your breath. Let the flickering torchlight soften in your mind's eye. The weight of ledgers and quills of taxes and turmoil drifts away like dust in a sunbeam. Feel your muscles, loosen your heart slow. Tonight you rest free from the chains of impossible demands from ink-stained fingers and counting sheep or chickens. The medieval tax nightmare is a tale of survival and chaos, but you here and now are safe. Breathe in, calm, breathe out, stress, and drift into a peaceful sleep where the only calculation is the rhythm of your breath.